Douglas Murray looks poised like a cat.
Yeah.
Douglas Murray destroys Eric Weinstein.
There was blood everywhere.
Not the way I cut it on my YouTube channel. So the issue is we have got to get more level-headed about immigration. We've got to stop fetishizing immigration. Yeah. Immigrants are not some special kind of person who's better than whatever you have in your country, which is how our politicians often sell it. Very often what immigrants do is if you have an economy that isn't growing at the proper rate through technology and really technologically led growth, you can create as-if growth by letting in more people to support things like a pension plan. So very often what people are experiencing is that they're being lied to about immigration by immigration experts. Immigrants somehow are a free lunch, they only create good things, they never create bad things, they don't tax systems, and then we treat everybody who wants to restrict immigration, like me, as if they had one reason for doing it. And what is that? Xenophobia, right? Now, somehow, I married an immigrant. A giant chunk of my friends are immigrants, so I'm living in an immigrant experience, even though my family isn't recently immigrated. So I never had any fears because I'm fascinated by language and music. Everything in my life suggests that I'm fascinated by foreign cultures. If you are, then in general you want borders because anything else is it's like pouring all the paint together. You're not going to get some beautiful rainbow in a can. You're going to get some sort of homogeneous thing that's not as interesting. So we've got to get away from these crazy ideas, this mimetic complex. In the US, we've got a poem on the base of a French statue that was given to us, written by somebody who was not part of the French delegation, Emma Lazarus, saying, "Give us your poor, you're tired," as if this was American immigration policy, which it has never been. It has never been our immigration policy, right? And we have to exclude people at borders, right? Borders, fundamentally, you're going to dilute people. And then you're going to treat people who are being diluted. Your vote will be diluted if you let in more people. So you have to be able to acknowledge that there are negatives with immigration.
And as you say, if you're
I'm on a head of steam here. Okay. The thing that you have to realize is that the people who hold the cards on the immigration narrative have this idea that if you let any daylight in with saying there's problems with immigration, you get some sort of horrific outcome.
Right.
And those people need to be humiliated.
Well, look what the German government's been doing. At the beginning of January of this year, the government in Germany enacted a new law which it's actually not entirely clear what it can do, but everyone already knows what it can do from social media, Facebook and so on. It's parts of the German government, including the intelligence services, working in conjunction with unnamed media companies to restrict the debate of the general public on these matters. Now, I just put it out there. Lots of Germans fuming about something they think of as being very unfair. What is the best way to make that blow up? Almost certainly to try to put a lid on it, dampen it down. A German publisher said to me recently, the public now here read our papers in the same way that people used to in Eastern Europe. They read between the lines. They read that yesterday a person did something to another person in a place. And they know they're not being given the information, so they fill it in themselves. Because they didn't name the person who did the act, it must have been a migrant, etc., etc., which actually means that the public mind thinks even worse than the facts that are happening. And I mean, and people think there's no potential downside to this. Just one other point on this. Eric hits, this is a subject of fascination for me because it's such a terrible moral question to try to answer. I like Eric. I don't have much tolerance for people telling me about the greatness of German culture and the importance of reinvigorating it and so on and so forth, because our ears start to jangle with rhymes and echoes. But at the same time, it's not possible, as Eric points out, it's not possible for a culture to live in permanent guilt with no form of redemption, ever. Ever.
And it's not fair.
It's not fair.
So,
right?
If you notice, having a conversation on immigration, I have, in a civilized way, waited to let you finish, which is part of the importance of this conversation. I was going to say that actually everything you said there, and that's what's if people in the audience do identify as centre left, The last thing you want to see is the breakup of the European Union and its surrendering to far-right populism. And I can guarantee you, until we and unless we reconsider this conversation around immigration, it will destroy Europe, not just in a cultural sense, but in a legal sense. So I'll give you an example of what's just happened in Denmark. A liberal, in the European sense of the word, in the British sense of the word, a liberal head of state and prime minister in Denmark has just overseen the approval in the Danish parliament of a law that is an attempt too late to deal with this question of a lack of integration in their country, of what they call immigrants and children of immigrants, and it's a euphemism for Danish Muslims. And what they've decided to do is approve a law in the Danish parliament that they will designate certain areas as, and they're using this word, ghetto areas. And the children born in these areas, who are born to immigrant parents but are born in Denmark, are named ghetto children. That's actually the phrase they're using. And they've decided, because they can't do this by religion or race or gender, they can do it by geographic area, and it's constitutional. And what they've said is that every ghetto child in these designated areas that the law stipulates will be obliged to go to citizenship class to learn how to be a Dane, and if they don't, the family will have their welfare withdrawn. But that doesn't apply to children who are outside of these areas that are the ghetto areas. The other thing they've said is that anyone who commits a crime in these ghetto areas will face double the punishment in criminal law than anyone who commits the same crime outside of these ghetto areas. You can see how a parallel legal system is in danger of developing here. And of course, what they've done is in Sydney, I think you have Lakemba and a few other areas where there's Australian Lebanese Muslims. Is it called Lakemba? What is it called?
Lakemba.
Lakemba, yeah. Right, so you can't say, okay, I'm going to do this where there's Muslims. What you could say is, okay, Lakemba is a troubled area. I'm going to do this in Lakemba. And everyone knows what you're really talking about is Muslims, right? Now, there is an example in liberal Denmark where this has happened. It's already, that's the case now. It's approved in Parliament. And of course, the dangers of a parallel legal system are self-evident. The dangers of grievances developing and people feeling like they are being judged for the same crime in double the punishment and therefore being discriminated against, all of that doesn't really need me spelling out. Why did that happen is the question. Why has liberal Denmark suddenly in their parliament approved this? And that's because of years of neglect of this one question, and that is integration. And it's why I'm saying that it's inseparable. We have to have a policy that ties immigration with integration and a sense of what the culture is of the countries that we're in. And that means slowing the whole thing down, because you can't have integration if your immigration is too fast. And so when I say to everyone who identifies here as centre-left, if Western secular liberal democratic civilization is what you genuinely want to preserve, then the fastest way to its destruction is to have an uncontrolled immigration policy that leads to these sorts of things that we're currently seeing in Europe, to a point where the far-right party can be the official opposition in Germany in 2018.
But Maajid, isn't the counterpoint to that to say, well, what culpability and responsibility does the far right have to take for this? It's all very well to say we on the centre-left are responsible for Brexit because we didn't have an appropriate conversation about how to handle the Syrian refugee crisis, but the people who made Brexit happen were the people who were promoting Brexit and telling lies about Brexit.
The problem I have with that argument is whenever we talk about extremism, we always do acknowledge that there are some grievances the Muslims have that led to them joining radical organizations. In my own case, I even cite that it was racism at home, it was the genocide in Bosnia, and in modern cases, in recent cases, the invasion of Iraq, right? It's not that we're saying ideology doesn't also play a role in radicalizing Muslims, but we recognize that there are some grievances that would have made it a bit harder for Muslims to become radicalized if they weren't there. Invasion of Iraq being a classic case in point, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq until George Bush went in. If we're going to apply that in the case of Muslims, then we must equally apply that framework in the case of right-wing radicalization. There are some grievances. I recently did a clip on my LBC radio show, and it was basically, what are the grievances of Tommy Robinson's followers? And they have some grievances that are legitimate that we need to address. One of them is the glaring double standard on Lauren Southern, who's Canadian. People will know who she is. She's a Canadian populist right, is it correct? Yeah, populist right-wing activist, I don't know. She was banned from entering the United Kingdom, right? Basically, she's a 20-something-year-old attractive young lady who hasn't got a terrorist hair in her or bone in her body. She has some objectionable opinions that we have the right to disagree with, but she doesn't have a terrorist bone in her body, but she was stopped at the UK border under the Terrorism Act 2000, in particular under Schedule 7. Schedule 7 denies your right to silence under interrogation at any port of entry or exit from the UK. Basically, what that means is it's a criminal offence not to answer the police's questions. And then she was deported, right, under terrorism laws. That same month, a cleric was allowed into the country from Pakistan, who's on the record supporting death for blasphemy. And then he was speaking at a counter-terrorism conference.
With a load of police.
With a load of police,
vicars.
giving the police an award for their counter-terrorism work. And he was in Manchester, right? And so you've got this double standard here, where Muslims can get away with all sorts of extremist rubbish, to put it mildly, and are let into their country, and the terrorism law that should be stopping them isn't stopping them. And you've got Lauren Southern, who's a 20-something-year-old young blonde woman that doesn't have any terrorism associated with her, deported under the terrorism law. Now, that's a legitimate grievance. Whether or not you agree with Lauren Southern, that's a legitimate grievance. And so if the invasion of Iraq radicalized a whole bunch of Muslims, that kind of behavior is going to radicalize a whole bunch of people towards the right wing. And we have to be consistent and acknowledge that there are grievances that can also radicalize people towards the right as well.
Bret Weinstein, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that there is an evolutionary force haunting this discussion, and I think it's worth just noting where it is and what kind of role it's playing. So, Douglas, when you point to this image of the boy washing up on the Turkish beach and this having a disproportionate impact on the conversation, there's an obvious evolutionary fact here, which is that none of us have ancestors that would ever have faced an image from thousands of miles away that would have been photorealistic and represented the tragic death of a child. In other words, to the extent that you saw a tragically dead child, it was a tragically dead child that was in your environment, and therefore you would have some pseudo-statistical way of analyzing what its implications were. But you can't analyze a photograph in isolation at that distance because you have no idea whether it's a common phenomenon or a rare phenomenon. You're not wired to detect the difference. And terrorism itself actually is based on this very error. When you hear that people have been blown up in some public situation, in some locale, you can't calibrate how much danger you're actually in. So the point is, if you are a force that cannot raise an army large enough to push a nation around, you might be able to push the nation around by psychologically manipulating it into overreacting. So just the same way a bee is not a threat to you, but your allergic reaction to its sting might be, you can cause a country to have an allergic reaction by utilizing the fact that the images of terrorism are much more powerful than the terrorists themselves are. So the fact that we are ancient creatures trying to navigate a modern landscape in which we have totally unrepresentative data, and then people who understand that the data is going to have effects on us employ game theory to cause us to have an emotional reaction to the question of immigration rather than a rational one. So I would argue we have to, in some sense, if you, as I do, believe that you must have borders, that they can't be open or you'll have a game theoretic failure of all of the successful policies within a country, but that immigration is desirable in some circumstances and should be allowed. If you're going to have that discussion and you're going to have a compassionate policy about immigration, it has to arrive out of a dispassionate discussion of the facts and how they interact. And all of this, in some sense, goes back to the question that Eric raises, which is why is it that nations, which I would argue evolutionarily are probably predisposed to xenophobia and to be resistant to immigration, are inviting it, and it has to do with this pyramid scheme of, it's an economic pyramid scheme where you can solve a temporary economic problem by creating phony growth, which causes people to believe they are economically better positioned than they are. That is to say, the members of the nation feel that things are getting better because they have artificially gotten an influx of well-being that is really the result of the fact that someone has been invited into the economic ladder below them, but that can only go on so long. And so the whole thing is going to unravel ultimately, and the only solution to it is to have a dispassionate conversation about how to be compassionate about this issue. But we can't get there until we recognize we're people who have inherited limits on what we can perceive and understand based on who we were 10,000 years ago, we're just not equipped for the modern media environment.
Sorry, just to clarify, Bret, why can it not go on forever? Why doesn't the migrant simply become a new Australian or American, and they replace you, and then you die, and then more migrants keep coming in, and the country keeps growing?
Well, there's a
Half
couple
of this country
reasons.
has arrived since the Second World War.
Sure, but there's a question about how large the population can get. So something, I believe it is 50% of the protein in modern people is the result of the Haber-Bosch process, which takes inorganic nitrogen and brings it into the biological cycle by burning fossil fuels in order to make it biologically available. So the point is, our population is way above what the ecosystems could possibly support, even if they were agriculturally farmed intensively. What we're doing is we're bringing in nutrients that weren't in that system to begin with, inflating the population, and ultimately these systems aren't going to be able to handle it. Then there's also the question that Maajid raises, which is there is a level of immigration at which the rate is low enough that assimilation is a natural consequence, that new immigrants find themselves better off by embracing the culture of the country that they're entering. But there's a point at which you've invited in so many people so quickly that what you effectively do is you create these subpopulations that retain their own distinct culture, and that creates an inevitable, I would argue, conditions for racism.
Yeah, I mean,
And extremism.
Yes.
I mean, example of this is, I mean, I'm not in favor of no immigration. I'm in favor of caution and of being careful. And one of the reasons of that is because I see a lot of unexpected consequences. Let me give you one obvious example of the country that Maajid just mentioned. Denmark, like most of Europe, had post-war immigration policies that basically invited guest workers in, and then the guest workers stayed, which they hadn't expected, and then various other things happened. Now, nobody was talking about Islam in this period. I mean, it wasn't in Britain until the Satanic Verses affair in 1989, when the fatwa was imposed on a British novelist by the Ayatollah, that we started talking about Islam in Britain, really. Yeah. And in Denmark, it didn't happen until 2005, when one newspaper editor, the editor of the culture section of Jyllands-Posten, discovered that in a set of children's books about the great religions, they couldn't find anyone to illustrate the one on the Islam, because nobody was willing to draw pictures of Muhammad. And so this newspaper editor, the culture editor of the paper, commissioned 12 people who were prominent cartoonists in Denmark to do cartoons of Muhammad. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Some of them did ones that were saying the paper's provocative and unnecessarily provoking Muslims. On the back of that, of course, there were riots all over the Muslim world. Quite a lot of people were killed. There were burnings of the Danish embassy and so on. And you know, and I got caught up in a little bit of that. And I was in Denmark for the 10th anniversary of the cartoons in 2015. And I was telling Maajid about this yesterday. It was there'd been an event on the 5th anniversary, but everyone who'd been at the 5th anniversary had been shot since the 5th anniversary, so it was hard to find people to speak at the 10th anniversary. And I and a couple of friends discovered we had headline billing, and it was only after realizing the situation with the 5th anniversary we realized why we were so prominent. But anyhow, this...
Gets funnier, this story.
Yeah, no, the funny detail was, I discovered afterwards that both the US State Department and the British Foreign Office had told British and American nationals not to go anywhere near the Danish Parliament or the centre of Copenhagen on this day because of the possibility of an attack on our conference. And I was like, well, they didn't tell me that. You know,
Hoping you got killed, Douglas. That's
yeah, probably. But anyhow, but the point is I mention this because I spoke to a lot of MPs that day that was in the Danish Parliament because it was the only building in Denmark that they could guarantee the safety of the audience in. Okay.
Yeah. Just think about that for a minute, folks. Seriously.
And actually, ISIS called for an attack on the conference, it turned out, that they couldn't get anyone there in time. And anyhow, I spoke to a lot of Danish MPs that day, and I remember one of them from the centre-right party said to me, I said, what's your view on immigration now? And she said, I don't want any more immigrants from the Muslim world. And I said, isn't that a bit, isn't that a bit simplistic and so on? And her response was, look, all the polling shows that 99.5% of Muslims think that you shouldn't be allowed to publish cartoons of Muhammad. So for every 100 people we invite in, there'll be 99 and more who won't allow our free press to keep on operating in a free manner. So I'm not taking that risk. Now, you can decry that and disagree with it, but it's an argument that's worth thinking about.
This also tells us something else, and that is something we've been neglecting for so long in Western debates about immigration, and that culture is a thing, and it's really important. And it's important because what it means, what do we mean when we say culture, is all of the values that bind us together, and it's our social contract. And if the social contract is being attacked, we don't know how to live together anymore. And so one thing that Goodhart is very good at in the UK is an author, David Goodhart. And we have been pretending for so long, especially through the 90s, with this word multiculturalism, that one culture is not in any way better than another. And so I think it was you and Sam, actually, both of you have been asked this question and posed this question before. And there is only one unequivocal answer to this question. Is what we enjoy here in Australia and the culture that we enjoy, however you want to define it, better than the culture that the Taliban want to create in Afghanistan? And there is only one unequivocal answer to that, and is yes, obviously. And you're being, again, people are gaslighting you if they equivocate in the answer to that question.
Yeah, I do think that that's unnecessary. I agree with that statement. So it's better here than the Taliban. Let's be clear.
I'll give way in a second.
I mean, the flat whites are much better here than they are in Kabul.
All I'm going to say is that so we've got to at least recognize that culture is as important to this debate as how fast or slow the immigration rate it should be, because it becomes a political problem.
The point is, that's overkill. Like what you said is true, but there's some people who can't make any value judgments because that would be cruel. Right?
Yeah.
All right, it's not about that.
Yeah.
You guys drive on a side of the road that I don't recognize as being the correct side of the road to an American. All right, is it better to drive on the left side or the right side? No, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that everybody drives on a common side, that you don't have things that are incompatible, right, running into each other. And so if you have some state that says church and state have to be separate, and you have another place that says church and state are the same thing, I don't need to get into a discussion about better or worse or values, because that's unnecessarily value-laden. I know that you don't want those two things. Are the Crips better than the Bloods as a gang? I don't know. I just don't want to house them in the same cell block of the prison, right? So there are certain aspects of this that are simply about compatibility that can evade the value judgment so that we don't have to get into that thorny territory. Now, there is I think way too much of this ends up for an American taste because we don't have the same issues with Islam yet in our immigration situation that Europe has. So in the US situation, what I would say is you have never, ever, ever heard an honest immigration conversation. The people who sound compassionate are not compassionate. You have a class of people I call immigrant-entrepreneurs who are making money based on immigration, like immigration lawyers or people who run pension plans, who are trying to figure these things out from a financial perspective. And what happens is that you have domestic groups transferring money amongst themselves. Like, let me steal some money from over here and give it to some people over here in the same country. The owners of capital say, hey, I see that labor is getting a certain share. If I can use immigration, I can beat down wages by pushing out the supply curve. And then fundamentally, I can capture a giant prize called the Borjas rectangle, just living inside a tiny efficiency gain in economics called the Harburger triangle. So you talk about the Harburger triangle as this little efficiency gain, but the real thing that you're salivating over is if I can just get labor to hate themselves for worrying about immigration, by worrying that there's somehow xenophobic, then fundamentally I can push down wages and make it impossible for people to agitate for more money, better conditions, et cetera, which is why it's so bizarre that the left has been fooled. I mean, it's just amazing. And I was told this by people in Washington. Somebody said to me, you don't understand how brilliant our immigration policy is. If you object to any part of it, you're a xenophobe. So we have a way of getting American labor to give up on itself because we will make them self-hating. Right? This is a conscious part of the conversation. And when I discovered in the 90s that in 1986, the American National Science Foundation had done a study of how to keep American scientists from making more money by using visas to make Americans mitigate their wage demands, I thought, this is completely bananas. We're supposed to be drawing our own people into our own fields, and we're secretly plotting against them using economic theory. And what are we doing? We're using immigrants as an invidious tool to transfer money between groups. And then what we do is we say, oh, you wouldn't hurt an immigrant, would you? Well, no, I'm not angry at immigrants at all. I'm angry at domestic rent seekers who have figured out how to manipulate the situation. It doesn't require culture. It doesn't require any discussion of Islam. The key point here is that you have never been allowed to have or hear a conversation about immigration in adult terms where compassion, where self-interest, I guarantee you that there's nobody on this panel who is for open borders, and there is nobody on this panel who is for closed borders. Right?
Just in the European context, though, I think the cultural conversation around Islam is particularly difficult to avoid because you've got citizens of Europe born and raised.
I'm not saying that there is no cultural issue. We have cultural issues in the US as well. And I do think, to be honest, that we benefit from a certain amount of foreign culture to give us hybrid vigor. Right? So it's not that I'm trying to keep American culture pristine and we have to only integrate. I don't want to only integrate. I'm pretty excited about immigrants, and I want to make sure that we have a sustainable stream for generations to come by not binging and purging and doing some sort of violent process that is based upon allowing people to manipulate our heartstrings against our better interests.
And Douglas, and there's a set of just good practice on this question, as on a lot of other questions, which is not to presume that you can see into the heart of people who disagree with you on an issue, because that is the reason why, as you say, you're a xenophobe if you want to have any textured discussion on it. This does unbelievable damage to the debate, and obviously that's one of the ones it's most pertinent on. But I mean, every single one of the tripwire issues of our time is vulnerable to this claim. I can see into your heart, and I know what you're secretly doing. And none of your words may do this, and none of your actions may do this, but I know what you're really after. This is a very dangerous thing to introduce into debate. Because
and this is what Kathy Newman is, the gift that keeps on giving. Because, we all went through that, so what you're really saying is the one move.
Right. And the real thing that comes to this, by the way, one way to solve that, which I've occasionally suggested, is that on this, as on other issues, there should be a punishment for frivolously making a claim that is untrue. So if, for instance, you frivolously claim that the people who disagree with you are all racists, you should suffer some form of societal shame and consequence equivalent to that which you are trying to hand out. Otherwise, there's just no reason not to keep doing it. I mean, I've said this to Sam before. We discussed this on your podcast when I suggested that when people erroneously make various claims against Sam, he should just say, well, it's just a shame you're such a paedophile. And they go, what? And, and if they say, I beg your pardon, he goes, it's not my fault you keep on shagging kids. And they go, what do you, and they go, we're all quite annoyed about it, but, and just keep, just keep going on.
Just don't say that to Maajid, because he'll get $3.4 million out of it.
But, you should say, look, you've made an insincere claim about me, and I'm doing one back.
This episode of the Waking Up Podcast is brought to you by Black Magic Chocolate.
You got stuck in a fight on this, didn't you, on your podcast? On immigration.
I want to hear from Bret, and then I want to hear from Sam.
Well, actually, I have I feel like we're evading the hard case here, and it was the point where Douglas started, where he claimed that we are simply not up to the super stimulus of the especially salient ethical conundrum of finding the corpse of a specific infant on a beach, or hearing too much of the pain of a specific family from some war-torn area, let's say Syria. I mean, the refugee. I mean, there's immigration, there's economic immigration, there's refugees, and those are somewhat distinct. But if you make the economic disparities sufficiently wide, they kind of run together. And I think it's hard to totally defend, in pragmatic terms, it's hard to defend those who are calling for open borders. But in ethical terms, I see their point, because we're living more and more in one world. And we want to live more and more in one world. We should want to live more and more in one world. We have problems, long-term problems, that can only be solved by thinking as a single species on a single planet, right? Nation states are not the end game for us as a species. And whether we ever get to something like a world government, we have to recognize the ultimate untenability of living within our borders as though we could solve every human problem by just being selfish up to the political boundary between, where one line was drawn on a map. And we know, I think all of us know, when we take the time to think about it, that we can't justify the ethical disparities in this world with respect to the variable of luck. I mean, some people are incredibly lucky to be born where they're born, when they're born, and some people are incredibly unlucky. And we're all very, very lucky not to have been born yesterday in Syria or 10 years ago in Syria. And when you focus on the specific case of a family in Syria trying to get out, there seems to be no ethical justification for not letting them in to this lucky circumstance. Now, when you pair that untenability with this other fact that the problem is not the problem we're talking about with respect to jihadism and a clash of civilizations and the differences between cultures, the problem is not the color of people's skin or the language they speak or where they came from or the food they like or the music they produce. The problem are the ideas in their heads that they're willing to organize their lives around and in many cases die for, or even let their children die for, right? And some ideas are so bad that we have to do almost anything we can to keep them out of our society. But the ideas obviously cross borders. They cross borders on social media. They cross borders with YouTube videos. And so it is, on some level, I mean, the real issue is that we have to win a war of ideas.
Often in the heads of the very same people you're feeling sorry for, which is an important point. It adds a layer of complexity, doesn't it?
But you take these specific cases. So, for instance, like if you said, I mean, this is something that happened to me in various contexts. I'm sure it happened at least once on my podcast, where I said, well, if you find a family of refugees, if we knew we could only let in 200,000 refugees, say, in any given year into the U.S., to learn that this set of 100,000 refugees were all Christians coming from these war-torn areas in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa, well, that would be relevant information. Insofar as we could actually know that they're Christians, that would be good news, because what we're worried about now at this moment in history are the jihadists we might be inadvertently importing. Now, to say that, as many Christocentric bigots would also say, is on the left tantamount to an expression of Islamophobia and bizarrely racism, but it is not an irrational preference. If you want 100% of jihadists are Muslim, right? To not admit that is to be just tongue-tied by your own masochism and white guilt, and to have been browbeaten by people arguing in bad faith. So the truth is, we really do want to know what people believe, and the question, how many more jihadists do you want in your society? The answer to that is always zero, right? It has to be zero. And so we have to argue about beliefs. We have to find out, insofar as that's possible, what people believe. We can't just treat it like it's the left side of the road. The left side of the road is good for you. The right side of the road is good for me. We just have to agree to disagree across borders, but within our borders, we have to stipulate that one thing works and the other doesn't. It's a bigger problem than that. We know that we are right to, insofar as it is possible, to go into Afghanistan and stop the Taliban from mistreating their girls, because they're not their girls, right? They're just girls who are unlucky to be born in Afghanistan.
Yeah, but Sam, I have to say that this is a rare point where I actually find that I'm in pretty serious disagreement with some of the things that you asserted without proof, which were that compassion for others in less fortunate circumstances. Some sort of Rawlsian veil should be treated with visas and citizenship. And
well, no, I'm not saying it's pragmatic to do it. I'm saying that's the tension here, because what I also fear, I think, is that if we did, so what would be the consequences of opening our borders? Let's say compassion won. Let's say we said, yes, there's no way to defend this disparity in good luck that we find ourselves enjoying here in Sydney, say. So we just open the borders to the rest of the world. What happens? I fear there that you'll have uncontained immigration to the point where there's simply, life gets bad enough in places like Sydney that there's no longer any reason to immigrate, right? So that it's like there's some perverse osmosis that we would witness where everything is brought down to the lowest common denominator. We don't want that. So obviously we can be selfish enough to defend our way of life in the face of that.
Selfish. I mean, like the language to me is so distorted. You know,
well, how much credit do you want to be given for being born where you were born in a context that was free of civil war?
I'm luckier than some and less luckier than others, and that is a part of the human existence. I don't believe that I have an obligation to reshuffle the world according to luck. I mean, no part of natural selection.
It's not an obligation, I'm just saying, but this is what makes the Douglas's starting point hard to parse, because given enough information, right, you meet the little girl. I mean, this is what happened to Angela Merkel. Like, someone brought the little girl right up to her. I mean, the little girl herself, I think, said, why are you keeping my family out, right? And that just overwhelmed, her
but any triage
empathy circuits.
Yes, I don't know how to say this, that the horror of the human condition and the beauty of the human condition are things that we have to accept. And what terrifies me is this sort of simplistic compassion that we have for erasing these differences. I mean, I didn't build the differences in. I don't necessarily like the differences, but I know that, for example, if I brought everybody in Bangladesh and India up to US levels of prosperity, I'd have an ecological disaster. Right? And so does that mean we're obligated to stop producing? Maybe. I'm certainly open to these discussions. But what concerns me is that the level of analysis is not equal to the problem that presents itself. That somehow we have become simplistically compassionate. And I don't want to give up the compassion. I want to give up the simplicity.
So I think we have to actually go back to Maajid's question about one culture being better than another, because actually once you tease that apart, some of these other issues become clearer. So there's one way in which it actually is impossible that one culture is better than another. It's like asking, are fig trees better than elephants? That question does not compute, right? You can't
No, they
answer.
are not. Elephants are amazing.
Well,
I'm with Josh here.
yeah.
Figophobic.
All right, I could pick a better example than fig trees, apparently. But nonetheless, the point is, at one level, all cultures are an evolutionary response to some circumstances. And in those circumstances, they are liable to be best. When we compare them under arbitrary circumstances, we've got a very different puzzle.
But you're privileging survival over human well-being.
No, I'm saying this is the least important fact about it. So we can say Inuit culture is surely best for the Arctic, right? If we took Aboriginal culture to the Arctic, it would last all of, an hour. So the idea is they're all equal. There is a justification for that claim, but that claim is trivial. And then there's a question about differences like the ones Eric points to, which are arbitrary. Which side of the road do you drive on? It doesn't really matter. There's not a better side of the road, but you've got to agree. And then there are places where there is actual betterness. But that betterness comes from an entirely different realm. That betterness comes from a place where we've actually agreed on values. In other words, we've said, this is something we would like to see more of, and then once we specify what this thing is that we would like to see more of, then we can say, well, this system produces more of it than that system. So, for example...
Or less of as well.
Sure. But if we take, for example, the difference between a polygynous system and a monogamous system, is one better than the other? No, they both evolve under different circumstances. But one is better if what you want to do is reduce violence and the tendency towards warfare. So there is no objective way in which we can claim that warfare is bad and that violence is bad, but of course everybody in the room would probably agree that they are bad from some other perspective, which is the values that we all share, which then goes to Sam's point. So if we can get to a conversation where whatever group of people it is that is trying to govern itself can agree on the values that it would like to see maximized, then we can have the conversation about what the cultural structures are that produce those values. And then we get into an issue with immigration, which is to the extent that you are inviting people in whose values are at odds with the values that the self-governing entity has agreed upon, what do you do about that?
Right.
Do you require embrace of the local values, or do you tolerate alternative values existing in some sort of pocket?
It's a very real problem that you're going to feel a moral duty to allow in a family that have survived a war in Syria where they were at risk of being enslaved by ISIS. And the high probability is that that same family unit, when you let them into a Western society, will hold ideas that could be homophobic, could also be anti-woman, could believe in death for blasphemy. And the same family unit that, on the one end, deserve your total sympathy and empathy, also have ideas
and by the way,
that could be hostile to others in your society.
I find this one fascinating because a little while ago I was, I've had like Maajid, I think various other people have, done a lot of traveling in my career and traveled to a lot of the world and seen some of the world's trouble spots up close. And it has always given me exactly the inverse of the kind of tub-thumping view that some people might ascribe to people like me. And it's the inverse because what it's persuaded me of is not the luck, but a sense of the fragility of a culture like the one I'm from. I'm not persuaded that it's a natural default of our species. I'm not persuaded that it's all that strong. I think, for instance, I mean, we've talked about this before, Eric, I'm not persuaded that the Enlightenment values that I think everyone on this stage shares an admiration for have gone down that deep or that wide, even in our own societies. So I'm not that persuaded that, you know, what I describe as the parochialism of the internationalists is a good response to this set of challenges. Because I mean, let me give you another example, by the way, which feeds off the example that Maajid just gave. Because we are actually able to have some of that conversation in other scenarios. Last year, I went to report on the war going on in the north of Nigeria. And there's a form of tribal and also religious conflict going on. And I was traveling around these villages, which are Christian villages, which are being attacked by these particular Fulani herdsmen. And they're coming on a regular basis, and they're raping women, they're macheteing pregnant women, and it's just hell, what's going on there. I came back to the UK, I was writing about it a bit, and I was just very struck by the number of friends of mine who I was describing this terrible situation to, who would say things to me, things like, well, you know, the Nigerian churches are very homophobic. And I'd be like, what? Well, I just don't have much sympathy for the Nigerian Christians. I mean, they're not attractive victims.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, sorry, the girl who'd just been shot through the leg, who was 4, doesn't strike me as being a useful person to take out your particular quibbles about homophobia in the Anglican Communion. You know, like, why are you doing that? But they can in that situation, or at least they feel kind of able to, and yet you have another situation, you say, a Syrian family, you were nowhere near that conversation in that.
And to give some facts to what you're just saying there, so the fragility of our values and the fact that our lack of defense over the course of the last decade or more for those values has actually led to their erosion in many instances. Just look at how fragile they are. So if you survey, you know, the last known survey done of British Muslims' attitudes towards homosexuality found 53% said that they would criminalize homosexuality if they were in power. And that's British Muslims born and raised in that country. That's not gay marriage they're saying they would outlaw. It's being gay that they said they would outlaw. 53%, by the way, is not an insignificant minority that is on the fringes. That's a majority.
And do you remember the 2010 when the same thing was that they asked different communities in the UK what their tolerance was? They came up in the UK Muslim community, 0% tolerance for homosexuals.
0% found it morally acceptable.
And it was like, is this like, you don't like civil partnerships? No.
Being gay. And there's one more.
Yeah.
There's one more for you. After the Charlie Hebdo massacres in France, when the Charlie Hebdo magazine was attacked by jihadists, a quarter of British Muslims responded to a survey suggesting they had sympathy for the attackers and not the attacked. So this is why values are relevant. Because, of course, I think it's a no-brainer that we on the center-left make a connection and say, if racism spreads in society, it makes it easier for people to be racist, which makes it easier for people to discriminate against others because of what they look like and their racial groups. But we somehow don't make that connection with extremist thoughts. And this is the failure of the left, or label it the regressive left, that we don't join those dots and say, if a significant enough people in our society's belief that blasphemers should be killed, it makes it easier for blasphemers to be killed.
But don't we have to point a mirror at ourselves in order to finish this out? In other words, there are certain things that we can look at, these extremist beliefs, and we can say, and I think with plenty of justification, those are inferior beliefs. They are abhorrent. On the other hand, so dare I guess.
Go on.
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's the. So
Twitter, get ready.
Let's talk about the burqa for a second.
Oh, please, yeah, I've been waiting to, yeah.
Good. So I would imagine that it would be a widely shared belief in this room, and certainly on the panel, that there's something very troubling about the burqa, and in particular,
it's a monstrosity.
I believe there would be a lot of resonance with that belief on the basis, at the very least, that part of your human birthright is to communicate via facial muscles, which are actually really unique. They are uniquely evolved for uniquely human stuff, and to deny a person the ability to use those things is barbaric. On the other hand, it struck me as hypocritical that we don't recognize that the burqa is one terrible solution among a whole pantheon of terrible solutions to a problem that's actually much older than humans. That there's a primate problem with groups in which there are multiple males. How do you get pair bonds to stick when you have multiple males jockeying for position? It's almost impossible to do. So we don't see it as a widely distributed property amongst primates. So human cultures have solved this in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of them absolutely monstrous, and beyond the burqa, of course, female genital mutilation, for one. So we have all of these bad solutions. I believe, without exception, the costs of them fall disproportionately on women. But the West, which doesn't have any of these things, the modern West, also does not have its shit together with respect to human sexuality. So we do things like sexualize young girls. We allow corporations to get into our minds and make people feel insecure about their bodies and their sexuality and all of this stuff. And then we monetize the sexuality of young women. And it's really kind of a despicable system in its own right. So you've got two different failure modes, neither of which are acceptable. But to focus on the one failure mode and not recognize the problem or the solution, the problem to which it is a solution, is not fair. And really, we ought to be having the conversation about how do we once and for all deal with this problem in some way that is fair to people and matches our values and doesn't require us to rationalize.
Isn't one answer to that to constantly be aware of the fact that this is just an ongoing tension? To recognize that there are tensions like this in our species, which we're forever going to have to...
There is a difference between a burqa and what you just, with respect, Bret, what you just said, because...
Don't text now.
No, I'm sure.
Maajid's just pulled his phone out.
Can everyone see that? I hope you
Of course.
There's a man on a beach. He's got no shirt on. He's in the sea, and he's got his baby girl there.
Yeah.
Can you see that, guys? Can you see that? Yeah, can you see that? Right?
Yep.
Right? He's on the beach. He's got his baby girl, and he's got a huge smile on his face, which you won't be able to see from over there. And here is an image. This is an image. I don't know if this is a photograph or a photoshopped image, but all of us have probably seen that at some stage in our lives. I certainly have. The man has got no shirt on, a bit fat. He's in the sea. He's got his baby girl in his arms. He's got a huge smile on his face. And his wife here is in a full burqa on the beach, right? Because she cannot take that off. And if she does want to swim, this is what she ends up looking like. She has to go in with her full burqa on her body, and she can drown like that, by the way. It's very dangerous. She can drown. Now, the difference between what you just said, advertising, the use of the female body and the male body, by the way, it's not just women who are sold in these adverts. There's a lot of pressure on men to look good as well. Don't I know it? So, but the point I was going to make very quickly is the following.
You rise to the situation admirably.
The difference is dogma, right? So what I find particularly morally objectionable to this burqa is the dogma that there in that heat on the beach, that woman cannot remove her clothing even if she goes into the water.
You don't hear me defending the burqa.
No, I know. I'm not saying you are. I'm not strawmanning you. I really genuinely am not. What I'm saying is that there is a serious intellectual and moral distinction between the way advertising companies use men and women to sell a product, which isn't a dogma, it's a market-driven thing, and if the market changes, that will change, and a religious dogma that regardless of changes to the market, changes to the weather, changes to the country geography or anything, will stick to this one thing, and regardless of the suffering it causes. And that's why I've got a problem in particular. Other people call it brainwashing, but I'm going to say dogma is... I know because for once upon a time, when I was 16, subscribed to a dogma. It is terribly corrosive and corrupting of the human mind.
Okay. Wait. I want to just fix one thing that you've said about my position before Eric jumps in here.
You're right, okay. Yeah.
Okay. It is not the advertising of stuff with female bodies that's getting to me. It is the exploitation of insecurities. That the way advertising companies get you to buy stuff you would not otherwise buy is by making you insecure. And sexual insecurity in particular is, they are maiming the psychology of large numbers of people by exploiting these insecurities in this particular way. That's one of a dozen different critiques we could level at the way...
And I think that's bad, but I don't think it's the same. That's what
I'm not saying it's the same, but I'm saying we need to be honest about the fact that we have not solved the problem that the burqa solves, right? We have invited a different... The burqa causes a problem, it solves a second problem, and we have eliminated the one problem and traded it for a different one.
I guess all I'm saying is, because I'm in the middle of this, the trenches of this debate, what I don't want people to hear what you're saying you're not doing, but I fear that it could be heard in your words that there's a moral equivalence between the two, and there simply isn't.
Well, but now we're having the same problem that we accuse the other side of. I mean, Bret is making a next level point, in my opinion, which some people will definitely misinterpret the first 3 times they hear it. But in part, one of the things that I didn't understand about multiculturalism is that we were never going to get multicultural. So those of you who have a phone where you can search, put in Zeki Müren in Turkey, and you will find that the national treasure singing sensation of Turkey is a guy who is gayer than Liberace, right? And it's very confusing. And then you can look at fatwas in Iran under the Ayatollah Khomeini allowing for sexual transition surgery, right? So if you actually look at the Islamic world, we are strawmanning the Islamic world in part. I'm not saying it does not have problems with homophobia. It absolutely does. What I am saying is that we did not even bother to learn all of the variants of Islam, all of the weird ways in which I cannot find a traditional society that does not make a place for non-binary individuals, right? In South Sulawesi, there are maybe 5 genders and they can become priests, whether you're talking about the Katuis in Thailand or the Hijras in India. Every single traditional society deals with homosexuality, deals with non-binary individuals, and there are things to exploit. You can ask yourself the question, hey, if you're cool with Zeki Müren in Turkey, how do we actually get that to work within the Islamic world that is now resident in the West? And so my concern about all of this is I don't know how to elevate the conversation and say, however much you were budgeting for this conversation, budget 10 times that. Because if we're not going to be able to live together harmoniously until we take an extraordinarily deep interest
On that, just on the religious grounds for why Iran does that, and Pakistan has the same thing. They're called so the hermaphrodites in Pakistan. There's actually most weddings in the Punjab have them perform, and they're quite accepted and normal. Is the fatwas acknowledge where there is a biological hermaphrodite-like situation, and therefore why they say you can choose your gender, and you can even alter your biologically undergo a sex change operation for the gender of your choice, because their starting point is God created you mixed, so that that's a dispensation. What they do not tolerate and do not allow, or what no fatwa allows in Iran or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, is homosexuality. It's a different thing too.
That's why people were offered sex changes in Iran if they're found to be gay. You could either be hanged or you could have
so
a
that
sex
can
change.
become very sinister.
Yeah.
You know. So homosexuality is very different to the sex change operation fatwa.
Let's just go to, we're going to have to go to questions in just a moment. So if you didn't get to ask a question last time, then please push your way to the front of the queue, and you'll be able to ask it as well. Maajid, in the past, you've been very articulate and useful in distinguishing between the different grounds on which one might be concerned about different spheres of the Muslim community. And I fear that it would be remiss of me not to raise the point. I mean, Eric just said that we're sort of strawmanning the Muslim world. I think we're also strawmanning a bit what happens to migrant communities once they come to the new world. So one of the concerns is the one that Sam raised about jihadist terrorist threats, so a security concern. But Douglas's point seems to be more about cultural assimilation and whether or not Enlightenment values can withstand the influx of people who don't share them. And you've been good about delineating between the difference between those people who might be anti-Enlightenment values. They're not necessarily jihadists. You know, the difference between conservative Muslims and so on. And I can just imagine people thinking about this conversation taking place in the 1950s in Australia, and people saying, look, there is no way that the Greeks and Italians are going to assimilate with broader Australian society. And then in the 70s, they'd say the same thing about the Vietnamese, and they'd say the same thing about the Lebanese. And here we live in a country that is actually very harmonious. And over time, these anti-Enlightenment values, I don't know what you would have gotten if you'd asked newly arrived Vietnamese refugees questions about social conservatism and their tolerance of gay people in the 1980s. Sure. But now their kids are cool with it.
So my father's generation, who migrated to the United Kingdom, would never have heard of Islamism. It was alien to them, and yet were conservative Muslims. My father prays 5 times a day. My grandmother from my mother's side wears a headscarf. And I think what I'm worried about, the difference is, of course, they then went on to have children, many of whom did integrate. The difference is if we stop having a conversation around why certain values matter and why they're important, then that won't happen. That's what I'm saying. And I think the danger is that we've basically, in a self-flagellating way, stopped asserting the superiority of certain values over others that are self-evident. As long as we can revive that, then what you've said will happen again. There's nothing stopping Muslims from integrating in the West. As long as we're having these conversations, and it's when we stop having these conversations that people lose their moral compass.
Douglas, wrap this up for us.
I really just wanted to make a final point, but it also picks up on what the very difficult point which Bret got us into. It's an important one, but it does allow me to come back to the thing we started on, which is the migration question. But I think there's a window through this question which helps us address others as well. I've been very struck in recent years by the way in which, as I say, in that debate, as with almost every other one of the tripwire debates of our time, it's set up so ruddy badly. And it's set up so badly because there is this ongoing presumption that the discussion is actually easy. And people make it easy for themselves by saying, my opponents are all evil, my opponents are all Nazis, my opponents are all fascists or racists or whatever. And when I was going around all the migrant camps and traveling all over to research my last book, I came to what I thought of as quite an important realization, which was that the whole thing was set up so badly because actually what was happening was there were competing virtues. And this goes back to the Bret point as well. And Aristotle addresses this, and I found it very useful in the migration debate, and I think it applies to others. Aristotle says that there are occasions when what is happening is 2 virtues are in competition. And it may mean that you're misunderstanding one of them, or misapplying one of them. And the one I realized in the migration discussion was there was a battle going on, not between good and evil, or between good guys and bad guys, or tolerant people and xenophobes. There was a serious tension between the call for human justice and the call for human mercy, and that these two things on this question are in fundamental opposition. The desire to be merciful to people and the desire to have justice for the place you are from, including for the people from the place you are from. And this same thing applies in so many of these discussions. And one way through the terrible way we have the discussions these days is to recognize that fact and open ourselves up to the difficulty of accepting that some of these things go, not between you and me, but right down the heart of ourselves. We all feel it. We all feel the thing that Sam mentions, the fucking luck we've got, the insupportable, unjustifiable luck. And we also know the fragility. And this is not one over the other, but both all the time, trying to master that within ourselves as well as a society.